What would you do if the only thing you could afford in the world was a home that was sinking? If the $2 you had left bought you nothing but rotten wood, river mud, and the scorn of every soul you met? For 19-year-old Bess Whitmore, this wasn't a question. It was the sharp-edged reality of an Arkansas morning in 1881. Cast out by the only family she had left for refusing to marry a man who valued a wife less than a good horse, she stood on the banks of the White River with everything she owned in a single cloth bundle. The world had told her she was worthless, and so she bought a worthless thing, a derelict houseboat, beached and forgotten, for the last $2 to her name. But what was nailed inside that hull, hidden from the world for a generation, was a secret that could drown a giant or build a new life from the wreckage. Settle in and let us know where you're watching from, as we tell the story of Bess Whitmore and the forgotten queen of the White River. The dust from her uncle's wagon had settled hours ago, but Bess could still feel the grit in her throat. He hadn't even looked at her as he dropped her at the edge of the settlement, her small bundle landing with a soft thud beside her. "You made your choice," he'd said, the words as hard and final as the slap of the reins on the horse's back. Her choice had been to say no. No to Mr. Abernathy, a man of 40 with a sour mouth and eyes that appraised her like livestock. Her aunt had called her a fool, ungrateful. Perhaps she was. Now foolishness was all she had. She walked through the small, dusty settlement of Cypress Bend, her gaze fixed on the ground. She felt the stares, heard the whispers. A girl alone was a story, and rarely a good one. She sought out the livery, not for a horse, but for the man who worked there. Silas was old, his back bent from a lifetime of labor, but his eyes were kind. He was the one who had slipped her the $2 silver that morning, his calloused hand closing over hers. "Heard old Finn's still got that wreck of a boat down on the flats," he'd murmured, his voice a low rumble. "Ain't much, but it's a roof." Now, following his rough directions, she left the last of the town's rough-hewn cabins behind, following a path that dissolved into a muddy track along the riverbank. The air grew thick, heavy with the smell of damp earth, cypress, and decay. And then she saw it. The word boat felt too generous. It was a carcass, a wooden skeleton half submerged in the thick brown mud where a slow-moving tributary fed into the main river. It listed heavily to one side, its paint peeling in long, leprous strips, revealing the dark, water-stained wood beneath. The roof over the small cabin had a hole gaping in it like a wound, and the porch railing had long since rotted away, leaving only jagged stumps. Cattails and sawgrass grew thick around its hull, weaving a shroud that seemed to be pulling it deeper into the earth. It was a picture of utter defeat, a monument to surrender. Bess felt a strange kinship with it. She, too, felt beached and broken, left to be swallowed by an indifferent world. For a long moment, she just stood there, the weight of her decision pressing down on her, as heavy and suffocating as the humid air. This was it. This was the kingdom her $2 had bought. She found old Finn living in a shack, propped up with driftwood not 50 yards away, a place that seemed only marginally more seaworthy than the boat itself. He was a gaunt man with a beard stained yellow from tobacco and a cough that shook his whole body. When Bess told him what she wanted, he let out a wheezing laugh that turned into a hacking fit. He wiped his mouth on his sleeve and squinted at her. "That thing?" he rasped, gesturing with a thumb toward the wreck. "Girl, the mud's got more claim to it than I do. But if you want to give me $2 to watch the river finish the job, it's all yours." He didn't bother with a proper bill of sale. He took her $2 silver, bit one to test it, and then scrawled "Sold 1 boat" on a scrap of butcher's paper with a piece of charcoal. He handed it to her, his eyes glittering with the mean satisfaction of a man who believed he'd just gotten the better of a fool. Bess took the paper, folded it carefully, and placed it in her pocket. It was the first thing she had ever owned. She walked back to the boat as the sun began to dip below the tree line, casting long, distorted shadows across the water. The air grew cool. The sounds of the river came alive. The deep thrum of bullfrogs, the trill of insects, the splash of a fish. She didn't dare step aboard. Not yet. The rot felt too profound, the darkness inside too complete. Instead, she cleared a small patch of ground on the bank, laid out her one spare blanket, and sat with her back against a cypress knee. She watched her new home as twilight bled the color from the sky. It didn't look like a home. It looked like a grave. Was this a fool's purchase? A final surrender to fate? Or was there a whisper of a promise in that rotten wood? What would you do with a home that the river itself was trying to reclaim? Let us know in the comments below, and be sure to subscribe for more stories of quiet courage on the frontier. Because as the first morning dawned, Bess would begin the slow work of listening to what the old boat had to say. The next day, Bess walked back into Cypress Bend. She needed supplies, and the few coins left in her pocket wouldn't stretch far. She bought a handful of nails, a small hammer with a cracked handle, and a ball of tarred twine at the general store. The storekeeper, a man with a perpetually suspicious squint, counted her coins twice before handing over the goods. As she stepped back onto the dusty street, she felt the town's collective gaze settle upon her. The whispers were louder now, less guarded. "That's the one," a woman said from the porch of the Mercantile. "The Whitmore girl. Heard she's living in that sinking wreck downriver." Her companion laughed, a sharp, cruel sound. Got what she deserved for being proud. The shame was a physical thing, a hot flush that crept up her neck. She kept her eyes down, focusing on her worn boots, one step at a time. Then, a larger shadow fell over her. "Well, look what the river washed up." The voice was loud, arrogant, and thick with contempt. Bess looked up into the face of Jedediah Thorne, the foreman for the Cypress Valley Lumber Company. He was a broad, imposing man whose presence seemed to take up all the air on the street. He looked from her face down to the pitiful collection of supplies in her arms and back again, a sneer twisting his lips. "Gonna build a palace out of that wreck, girl?" he boomed, for the benefit of the onlookers who had gathered. "Don't waste your nails. The river will have that thing for firewood by the first flood. Should have taken the marriage. At least you'd have a dry bed to sleep in." The men with him chuckled. Bess said nothing. She had learned long ago that silence was the only shield she possessed. She simply stood there, meeting his mocking gaze, her chin held a fraction higher than before. Her lack of response seemed to infuriate him more than any retort could have. He spat a stream of tobacco juice into the dust near her feet. "Suit yourself. Just stay off company land." He and his men moved on, their heavy boots kicking up dust, leaving Bess standing in a cloud of humiliation. She was about to turn and flee back to the solitude of the river when a soft voice stopped her. "Child." Bess turned. An old woman sat on a bench in the shade of the land office, her face a beautiful map of wrinkles, her dark eyes holding a deep, quiet wisdom. She was Ilara, a woman of the river, part of a family that had been there long before the lumber company, long before the settlement itself. She hadn't been laughing. She beckoned Bess closer with a slight movement of her hand. Hesitantly, Bess approached. Ilara looked at the hammer, at the nails, and then into Bess's eyes. Her voice was as soft as river moss, but it carried a strange weight. "Some boats aren't meant to travel," the old woman said, her gaze distant, as if she were seeing something far beyond the dusty street. "They're meant to hold." Bess didn't understand. She murmured a quiet thank you, unsure what she was thanking her for, and turned away. The cryptic words followed her, a small, smooth stone in the churning river of her thoughts. The walk back to the houseboat felt longer this time, each step heavier than the last. The town's scorn was a physical burden, Thorne's laughter a ringing in her ears. Only Ilara's strange sentence offered any sort of counterweight, a puzzle she couldn't solve. What was a boat meant to hold, if not a person traveling on the water? The question stayed with her as she finally reached the clearing and saw the wreck waiting for her, silent and patient in the afternoon sun. She forced herself to step aboard. The deck plank she tested with her foot gave a low groan but held her weight. She took another step, then another, moving with the caution of someone entering a bear's den. The air inside the small cabin was thick and sour with the smell of mildew and stagnant water. A film of green algae covered the walls where the rain had leaked through. The floor was soft in several places, and a puddle of black water stood in one corner. Everything was coated in a layer of dried mud and grime. It was worse than she had imagined. Jedediah Thorne's mocking voice echoed in her head. "The river will have it for firewood." For a moment, despair washed over her, cold and numbing. This was impossible. It was too much. She sank down on the one dry patch of flooring, her small bag of nails spilling beside her. She could leave. She could walk until her legs gave out, find work on some remote farm where no one knew her name. But then what? She would be just as alone, just as rootless. Here, at least, was something that was hers. This rotting, forgotten thing belonged to her. A stubborn spark ignited in her chest. They had all written it off. Thorne, the town, Old Finn, they had written her off too. A quiet resolve hardened within her. Let them laugh. She would not let the river win. She would not let them win. She picked up a nail, its sharp point cold against her palm. It was a start. That evening, she didn't sleep on the bank. She cleared a space on the cabin floor, laid her blanket over the driest boards, and slept inside her home for the first time. The boat groaning softly around her like a living thing settling into a long overdue sleep. The sound should have been frightening, but to Bess, it sounded like a promise. The work began in earnest. Bess rose with the sun, her days governed by the slow, rhythmic labor of reclamation. Her first task was the gaping hole in the roof. She used a piece of driftwood to scrape away the rotted shingles and soft wood, then stretched the small piece of canvas she'd managed to buy across the opening. She didn't have proper tar, so she used pine pitch, painstakingly gathered from the surrounding trees, and heated over her small fire until it was a thick, black goo. She sealed the edges of the canvas, her hands sticky and stained, the smell sharp and clean. It was an ugly patch, but it was watertight. Next, she turned her attention to the inside. She shoveled out bucket after bucket of mud and debris. She found rotted fishing nets, a single cracked porcelain cup, the skeleton of a small animal. She scrubbed the walls with river sand and a bundle of stiff grass, working until her arms ached and the wood began to show its true color, a pale silvery gray. She pried up the softest floorboards, replacing them with planks salvaged from a collapsed section of the tiny porch. The boat became her entire world. She learned its language, the creak of a beam under pressure, the hollow sound of wrought, the solid thud of sound timber. Her hands, once soft, became a roadmap of her efforts, calloused and crisscrossed with small cuts and splinters. Her silent companion in this work was the hammer she'd bought. It was old, the handle darkened with the sweat of a previous owner, but it was perfectly balanced. It felt like an extension of her own arm. Each nail she drove was a small act of defiance, a quiet declaration. I am still here. This is still here. As she worked, she began to notice the details of the boat's construction. This was no crude shack set afloat. The joints were tight, the beams expertly notched. Whoever had built it had been a master craftsman, a man who understood wood and water. He had built it to last. This knowledge made the boat's state of decay feel less like a failure and more like a tragedy, a long, slow abandonment. One afternoon, she was working on the interior of the hull, trying to seal a persistent leak near the waterline. The cabin was cramped, the air thick and still. To get to the leak, she had to pry away a section of the thin wood paneling that lined the inside of the hull. As she worked her pry bar behind a warped, water-stained plank, she felt something give. But it wasn't the familiar splintering of rotten wood. It was the sharp, protesting screech of a nail being pulled from sound timber. She stopped, frowning. She ran her fingers along the edge of the plank. The nails holding it in place were different from the others around it. They were newer, their heads less rusted, and they had been hammered in with a force that had slightly splintered the surface. It looked less like a part of the original boat and more like a patch. But it wasn't covering a hole to the outside. It was just one plank among many on the inside wall. It was too deliberate, too neat. She tapped it with the handle of her hammer. The sound wasn't the light, hollow rap of the other panels. It was a dull, solid thud. There was something behind it. Her curiosity was piqued, a small flicker in the steady flame of her labor. But the leak was her priority. The weather was turning. The sky to the west, a bruised purple. A storm was coming. She made a mental note of the strange plank, a quiet question she would return to, and went back to work, mixing a paste of sawdust and pine pitch to plug the nagging seep. Days turned into a week, then two. The ugly canvas patch held against the first autumn rains. The cabin was no longer a damp, foul-smelling cave. It was a small, clean space, sparse but dry. Bess had fashioned a crude bed frame in one corner and a small table from a salvaged crate. She spent her evenings by the light of a single tallow candle, mending her clothes or simply listening to the river. The loneliness was a constant presence, a dull ache in her chest. But it was no longer laced with the sharp panic of her first days. Here, in the quiet solitude, she was beginning to feel not just a sense of ownership, but of belonging. Her labor was a form of prayer, and the boat was slowly answering. The more she worked, the more she felt the presence of the man who had built it. It was in the smooth curve of a hand-hewn beam, the clever design of a small storage locker built into the wall. He had loved this boat. So why had he abandoned it? The question circled back to the odd plank in the hull. The image of it stayed in her mind, a lock without a key. She had become so attuned to the boat's rhythms, its honest aches and pains, that this one piece of deliberate concealment felt like a secret it was keeping from her. One evening, as a low mist rolled in off the water, shrouding the world in a soft, gray silence, she decided she could wait no longer. The practical repairs were done. The boat was stable. It was dry. Now, It was time for its secrets. She lit her lantern, the flame casting huge, dancing shadows on the walls of the small cabin. She picked up her pry bar. The cool, heavy iron felt solid in her hand, a tool for discovery. She approached the wall, her heart beating a little faster. It was time to ask what the boat was holding. She slid the thin end of the pry bar behind the edge of the plank. She paused, listening. The only sounds were the gentle lap of water against the hull and the soft hiss of the lantern. It felt like a violation, breaking into a space that had been sealed with such intent. But the boat was hers now. Its secrets were hers, too. She put her weight into the bar. The first nail groaned, a long, mournful screech of metal against wood. Then the second, and the third. The plank resisted, holding fast to a secret it had kept for decades. Finally, with a sharp crack, the wood splintered around the last nail and the plank came free. Bess set it carefully on the floor and held the lantern up to the opening. Behind it, nestled perfectly between two of the boat's curved ribs, was a small, dark cavity. And inside that cavity lay a package. It was wrapped in thick black oilskin, the folds sealed with wax and tied securely with tarred twine. It was remarkably well preserved, untouched by the dampness that had ruined so much of the surrounding wood. Her hands trembled slightly as she reached in and lifted it out. It was heavier than she expected, dense and solid. She carried it to her small table and sat down, the lantern light pooling around it. For a moment, she just looked at it. Who had put this here? And why? With fumbling fingers, she broke the wax seals and began to unknot the stiff, tarry twine. The oilskin was brittle, cracking slightly as she unfolded the layers. Inside, protected from the elements, was a stack of papers and a thin, leather-bound ledger. She lifted the top document. It was a map, hand-drawn with incredible precision on a piece of treated linen. It showed a long stretch of the White River, detailing sandbars, tributaries, and depths. It noted the locations of old trading posts, stands of valuable timber, and trapping lines. In the bottom corner, in elegant script, was a signature, Auguste Dubois, 1842. She carefully set the map aside and looked at the next set of papers. These were different. They were official, bearing the wax seal of the Arkansas Territorial Governor. Her breath caught in her throat as she read the formal, looping script. They were trade licenses, not just for a year or two, but granted in perpetuity to one Auguste Dubois. They gave him exclusive rights to all trade, trapping, and passage along a 40-mile stretch of the river, the very stretch where the Cypress Valley Lumber Company was now operating. Her eyes scanned the legal language, her heart beginning to pound a heavy, rhythmic beat against her ribs. There was no expiration date, no clause of revocation. Below the licenses were several certificates of deposit from a bank in St. Louis, made out to Dubois for the sale of furs and land. The sums listed were staggering. A small folded note attached to them, the ink faded but still legible, read simply, "Accounts to be held in trust. Never closed." Bess sank back, her mind reeling. This wasn't just a boat. It was a time capsule, a vault. Auguste Dubois hadn't abandoned his life's work. He had hidden it, nailed it into the very heart of the vessel he had so clearly loved. And the rights he had hidden, the legal claim to the entire valley, were now sitting on a rough-hewn table in front of a 19-year-old girl in a forgotten, rotting boat. The laughter of Jedediah Thorne suddenly seemed very far away. The world had just tilted on its axis. The discovery left Bess in a daze. For 2 days, she barely slept, reading the documents over and over by candlelight. tracing the lines on the old maps with her finger. The papers felt charged with a strange power, the weight of a man's life and legacy. She understood now what Alara had meant. The boat wasn't meant to travel. It was meant to hold this history, this claim. But what was she, a girl with no name and no standing, to do with it? The answer came not from a plan, but from the river itself. The sky had been growing darker for days, the air thick and heavy with unspoken rain. Then the storm broke. It came without warning, a furious squall that turned the placid river into a churning, brown monster. Rain fell in solid, blinding sheets, and the wind tore through the cypress trees with a sound like a grieving scream. The river began to rise, swelling over its banks, creeping higher and higher up the hull of her boat. From her small window, Bess saw the true power of the lumber company. Upriver, they had released a massive raft of logs, trying to get the timber to the mill before the floodwaters became impassable. But in the storm, the raft broke apart. Huge, raw logs, some as big as cannons, were unleashed into the torrent, tumbling end over end, a destructive, chaotic stampede of wood. They smashed against the banks, tearing out trees and gouging away the earth. Suddenly, through the deluge, Bess saw something else. A small ferry, caught in the middle of the channel. Its engine had clearly failed, and the ferryman was struggling vainly with a long pole against the raging current. On board was a family, a man, a woman clutching a small child. They were being swept directly into the path of the marauding logs. Panic seized them, their faces pale with terror. Bess's heart hammered against her ribs. Then she remembered the maps. Dubois' map had shown a deep eddy just here, a calm pocket of water created by the very mudflat where her boat was beached. The rising water had partially refloated her home, but the thick mud held it fast, a stubborn anchor against the flood. Her boat, the town's joke, was creating a sanctuary. Without a second thought, she grabbed her lantern, though it was barely midday, and fought her way out onto the pitching deck. "Here!" she screamed, her voice nearly lost in the roar of the wind and water. "Behind the boat! Pole for the calm water!" She waved the lantern, a small, desperate beacon in the gray chaos. The ferryman, Miller, saw her. He seemed to understand. With renewed strength, he and the other man plunged their poles into the water, fighting the current, inching their small craft sideways, out of the main channel. They slipped behind the stern of Bess's houseboat, just as a massive cypress log, roots and all, crashed into the bank where they would have been moments later, the impact shaking the very ground. Trembling, the family tied their ferry to Bess's sturdy mooring post. She helped them aboard, bringing the shivering woman and her little girl into the dry warmth of her small cabin. She gave them her only dry blanket and shared the small pot of cornmeal she had cooked that morning. Through the long night, as the storm raged and the river roared, the five of them huddled together in the tiny lamp-lit room, safe inside the rotting boat that everyone had dismissed. In that moment, Bess knew she was no longer just its owner. She was its keeper. The storm broke at dawn. The river was still a swollen, muddy torrent, but the rain had stopped and a watery sun was trying to break through the clouds. The ferryman, Miller, couldn't stop thanking her. "You saved us," he said, his voice thick with emotion as he looked at his wife and daughter, safe and asleep under Bess's blanket. "That boat of yours, it's anchored like a rock, and you knew. You knew right where the calm water was." He told her he'd spread the word of what she'd done. He and his family left later that morning, once the current had eased enough for them to safely pole their way back to Cypress Bend. True to his word, the story traveled fast. When Bess next walked into the settlement, the whispers that followed her were different. The mockery was gone, replaced by a grudging curiosity, a murmur of respect. She wasn't the crazy girl in the mud trap anymore. She was the girl who had faced the storm and saved the Miller family. This new, fragile reputation gave her the courage she needed. She took the oilskin packet, wrapped it carefully, and used what little money she had to buy a seat on the mail wagon to the county seat, a larger town with a courthouse and proper lawyers. She found the office of a Mr. Abernathy, a young lawyer whose shingle looked newer than the others. He listened to her story with a professional skepticism, his expression unchanging as she spoke of the boat, the storm, and the hidden compartment. But when she unwrapped the oilskin packet and laid the contents on his desk, his demeanor shifted. He picked up one of the trade licenses, his fingers tracing the territorial governor's seal. He held it up to the light, his eyes widening slightly. He spent an hour examining the documents, comparing the maps to his own county surveys, his initial skepticism melting into focused excitement. "Good heavens," he murmured, looking up at Bess with a new light in his eyes. "Do you have any idea what these are?" He explained it to her in simple terms. The licenses were ironclad, predating the state charter granted to the lumber company by nearly 30 years. Auguste Dubois' claim had never been relinquished. For 2 decades, the Cypress Valley Lumber Company had been operating illegally. They were, in a word, trespassers, and they owed Dubois' estate a fortune in damages. "And you, Miss Whitmore," Abernathy concluded, a slow smile spreading across his face, "as the owner of his last known property, are the sole heir to that estate." A week later, Bess returned to Cypress Bend, but this time she was not alone. Mr. Abernathy walked beside her, his leather satchel full of legal papers. They went directly to the lumber company office. Jedediah Thorne was there, along with the company superintendent. Thorne laughed when he saw her. "Come back to beg for a job, girl?" His laughter died in his throat when Mr. Abernathy calmly began to lay the documents out on the desk. The map, the licenses, the bank certificates. A crowd of townspeople had gathered outside, drawn by the sight of the lawyer. They watched in silence through the window as Abernathy explained the legal reality. Thorne's face went from disbelief to fury, and finally, to a pale, slack-jawed shock. The swagger was gone, replaced by the cold understanding that his world had just been upended by a teenage girl and a ghost. The town watched as the balance of power shifted, as quiet truth silenced a bully's roar. The final scene is not one of explosive triumph, but of quiet, earned peace. Weeks have passed. The late autumn sun hangs low in the sky, casting a warm, golden light across the water. Bess sits on the small, sturdy porch she has built onto her houseboat. The boat itself is transformed. It no longer lists in the mud but floats gently, moored to the bank. The hull is patched and painted a deep forest green. The roof is solid, and a thin curl of smoke rises from a new tin chimney pipe. It is no longer a wreck. It is a home. Locals have taken to calling it the River Queen. The lumber company, faced with irrefutable proof and the threat of a ruinous lawsuit, had settled. A significant sum was paid, enough to reactivate the street, Louis bank accounts, and ensure Bess would never be destitute again. But she had asked for more than money. Guided by Dubois' maps and Abernathy's legal counsel, she had forced the company into a stewardship agreement. Vast swathes of old-growth cypress along the riverbank, The very areas Dubois had marked as vital to the river's health were now protected from logging. She had not driven the company out. She had taught it to live with the river, not just on it. Mr. Abernathy stands beside her, holding the final signed papers. He looks from the restored boat to the protected valley, a look of deep admiration on his face. "You've done a remarkable thing, Miss Whitmore," he says. "You've saved more than just a boat. What will you do now?" Bess doesn't look at him. Her gaze is fixed on the river, on the way the light turns the water to liquid amber. She has found her place not in a family's home or a husband's house, but here, in this small floating cabin, anchored to a purpose she had discovered in the heart of a forgotten thing. She thinks of the town's laughter, of Thorne's scorn, of her own despair on that first day. She thinks of the quiet dignity of the boat's builder and the legacy he entrusted to the water. A soft, small smile touches her lips. "I wasn't buying a boat," she says, her voice quiet but clear over the gentle sounds of the evening river. "I was accepting a post. Thank you for joining us for this story of quiet resilience. It reminds us that sometimes the greatest treasures aren't buried in the ground, but are waiting in the things society has thrown away. If this story moved you, please leave a like and a comment, and subscribe for more tales of the unsung heroes of the frontier. We'll be back next week with the story of a lone prospector and the strange, silent music he found deep in the heart of the mountains.